Brothers and sisters, our gospel lesson today comes from Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. Listen to the word of the Lord. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Thanks be to God for the reading and the hearing of this word. My friend, Pastor Jones, serves a church in one of the at-risk communities outside of Charleston, South Carolina. Her community is plagued by crime and drugs and poverty. In fact, it's not uncommon for Pastor Jones to find someone wandering into the church looking for money. For some reason, always $40. But Pastor Jones has her response. "I understand that you need $40, but I don't have $40 to give you. What I do have is this box of food. Do you want that?" Well, sometimes the people object. They need $40, not a box of food. But for those who accept Pastor Jones' gift, they receive so much more than mere physical food. They find in Pastor Jones a pastor who genuinely cares about them, someone who will accept them, involve them, include them in her church community. They find not just physical food, but spiritual food as well. Well, in our gospel lesson today, the crowds discover much more than they expected when they encounter Pastor Jesus. The crowds have heard that Jesus is returning to their region, and they rush to meet him. When Jesus' boat lands and he disembarks, he is greeted by a throng of people who have come seeking his attention. But of course, the people receive so much more than just a moment with Jesus. They receive his compassion. They receive his healing. And when the hour grows late and the sun sinks low in the sky, when their bellies begin to rumble with hunger, they are even treated to a divine feast. The people come looking for a mere moment with Jesus, but they receive so much more. Of course, the disciples aren't too sure about this. The disciples, they're not convinced that this is such a good idea. For one thing, the disciples are worried about Jesus. After all, Jesus has just learned that his cousin, John the Baptist, has been brutally murdered. Surely, they think, Jesus needs some space. What's more, they're worried about the people. After all, they are in the middle of nowhere. The hour has grown late. Surely the people need to go home and get something to eat. And let's get down to brass tacks. quite truthfully, the disciples are worried about their resources. The disciples have already taken inventory. They know what they have available: 5 loaves and 2 fish. Nowhere near enough to feed themselves, let alone the multitude. Surely it's time to call it a day. The disciples are not at all certain that this is such a good idea. But we know how the story ends. We know that 5 loaves and 2 fish in the hands of Jesus is more than enough to feed the multitude. We know that when Jesus takes the bread and breaks it, when he distributes it to the people, that it is multiplied so that everyone eats their fill. And at the end, they have more left over than what they had to begin. In the hands of Jesus, we know that a little is more than enough. Perhaps you've heard the legend of the great Polish pianist Pedruski playing chopsticks in the grand concert hall. It's a legend about a mother who wanted to inspire her little boy in his foundering piano lessons, so she took him to hear the great pianist. Well, lo and behold, the mother, before the concert began, became distracted, and the little boy got bored and somehow managed to find his way onto the stage, where he began to play the master's piano. Let me pause there for just a moment. I need to give you a warning that this is totally something that my son Jacob would do. Now, Jacob doesn't play the piano, but when he was 3, he actually did something very much like this. It was Christmas time, and I was teaching a Bible study, an evening Bible study on the portrayal of the Christmas story in the different Gospels. My husband had to work late, so I thought I would just take Jacob with me. Surely he would be distracted by the rare gift of screen time while I taught. But it wasn't long before I felt a small presence beside me. It was Jacob. "Mommy," he asked, "can I tell them about when Jesus was born?" And then he just turned to face the class. "That's when I get my Paw Patrol Sea Patroller," he said, which of course was the hot ticket item on his Christmas list that year. The class completely ate that up. And I'm pretty sure that while they don't remember a thing I said that night, they all remember Jacob. Well, as it happens, it was exactly the same for Pedruski. Because when the great pianist walked out on stage and saw a little boy plucking out chopsticks on his piano, he responded with uncommon grace. Pedruski crept up behind the boy undetected. He leaned down and whispered in his ear, "Don't stop, just keep playing." Then he reached out with his left hand and began to add a bass line. He reached around the boy with his right hand and added a running obligato. And together, the little boy and the great pianist Pedruski created a masterpiece. That night when they left the concert hall, no one remembered what else Pedruski had played, but they all remembered chopsticks. Well, brothers and sisters, like I said, it's a legend. As far as we know, it isn't true. But it certainly illustrates the truth of what God does for us when we offer our meager offerings to him. God takes what we have to offer and embellishes them and transforms them to serve God's purposes so that God's name will be glorified. In fact, while the legend may not be true, Pedruski himself actually embodied the legend in his own life. You see, as a concert pianist, he gained incredible fame throughout the world, fame that gave him a platform to serve as an ambassador and a diplomat lobbying for an independent Poland during World War I. In fact, after Poland did achieve independence, Piłsudski even served as one of its first prime ministers. God had worked through his offering of his musical gifts to do so much more than anyone could have imagined. God had worked through Piłsudski to bring forth God's glory and to bring forth God's purposes, just as God does for us. And so, brothers and sisters, that is my prayer for us as we begin this journey together. That we would discover together the gifts and resources that God has given to us as individuals and as a community. That we would boldly offer our gifts to God, and that by God's grace, they might be transformed to feed the multitudes. To God be the glory. Amen.